Someone very wise once said, "Money can't buy happiness, but it can buy chocolate," which is pretty much the same thing. Let me ask you, do you know what it's like to hunger for chocolate? I mean, maybe you saw the movie Chocolat that came out way back in the year 2000. I mean, Chocolat is a film about this peaceful little village where one day a woman and her daughter, they come to a town and they open up a chocolate shop. People in the town are very suspicious of strangers, but since there's no other place else in town to satisfy the craving for chocolate, pretty much everybody in town starts frequenting her shop, except for one man, the mayor of the town. The mayor seems to be a person who, he's got it all. He's wealthy, he has clout like nobody else does in town. He's very respected. He's even very religious, upstanding type of guy. He politely greets everyone at the church door on their way to mass each week. But for some reason, the mayor is against this chocolate shop and tries to keep everyone away from it. In fact, he actually tries to shut the place down. He shuns the woman who runs it and tries to ruin her and run her out of town. For some reason, he doesn't want anybody satisfying their hunger for chocolate. Today we're continuing a series we've been in for the last few weeks called Beautiful. And here we're looking at the series of blessings or beatitudes that Jesus spoke literally to thousands of people who had gathered on a hillside to hear him. Now, unless for some crazy reason you don't like chocolate, most of us know what it is to have a hunger for chocolate. But in the Beatitudes, Jesus talked about hungering for something that may not be as familiar. Here it is in what he said. He said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Today we're talking about a beautiful hunger, which at first glance it sounds rather odd, doesn't it? How can we be hungry or be thirsty? How can that ever be seen as beautiful? I mean, if you're anything like me, when you get hungry, you get a little hangry. That's not beautiful at all. I mean, the only thing that makes hunger beautiful is when I get some finger-licking barbecue ribs right in front of me. So what does it mean when Jesus says this? To understand, we need to understand and really focus on the word righteousness. How many of you are familiar with the term self-righteous? I mean, if someone is being self-righteous, it typically means that they're doing the right thing while others are missing the mark. I mean, if I somehow have figured out how to parent my children well, but you're still struggling, and I look at you with this air of smugness and think, I mean, how could you not figure this out? And maybe add a little bit of a layer of spiritual smugness to it, like, you're a Christian, and you still can't figure this out. That, my friends, that's being self-righteous. But if I ever think that God is pleased with me, but not with you, if I ever assume that I'm inside God's will, but you're not, I mean, self-righteousness comes into play when I believe that God loves me, but you, I'm not so sure. And when someone is smug like that, we say, stop being so self-righteous. But if we take away the negativity that comes with being self-righteous, being righteous is actually quite beautiful. Because ultimately what righteousness means is that we are in good standing with God. Now, I assume that all of us are at least somewhat familiar with the court system, that maybe we know a lawyer, or we've been to court, or we've served on a jury. And so if you're somewhat familiar with how the court proceedings work, you know what it means to be in good standing with the law. If you're the plaintiff or the defendant, and the judge or jury makes a decision in your favor, you are in good standing with the court. And if we were to look back at a couple of books in the Old Testament, the books of Leviticus and Numbers, we see that the Israelites, they came up with this very complicated, complex system that determined whether people were in good standing with the community. And if you're in good standing with the community, it meant you were also in good standing with God. But if you were not in good standing with the community, it meant that you were not in good standing with God. That was a problem. It was a massive problem because it kept all kinds of people from believing that they were in good standing with God. I mean, can I share a few examples? If you were a woman And it was that time in the month you were considered ceremonially unclean. You're actually banished from the community until that time was over. And you had to go to the temple to offer an appropriate sacrifice in order to be in good standing with God again. I mean, can you imagine if we attempted to employ that rule today? Or if you gave birth to a boy, you were unclean for 33 days. If you gave birth to a girl, you were considered unclean for 66 days, which means that you weren't allowed to go to the temple for 2 months. Elsewhere, Leviticus 13 says that if a man had a sore on his head, he's banished from the community until that sore goes away. If the sore never goes away, he can never return. If someone has sores all over their body, they must tear their clothes, they must scream out, unclean, and banish themselves from the community forever. I mean, you following? In fact, we read more than 600 laws and hundreds of policies in the Old Testament that made someone either clean or unclean. Clean meant that you were in the community, but unclean meant that you were banished from the community, sometimes for life. Now, what may have started out as a way to keep the community healthy very quickly devolved into a system where people were declared, here we go, righteous or unrighteous before God. Let me make this simple and clear. If you were an Israelite who was healthy and wealthy, you were declared clean and righteous before God. But if you were unhealthy, poor, or a foreigner, you were deemed unclean and unrighteous before God. I mean, can you imagine the shame and the embarrassment and the ridicule that these men and women faced? Being declared unclean, being kept away from the temple of God, being banished from the community that you once called home. I mean, maybe some of you have experienced this kind of pain and shame before. Maybe you've been an outcast in your own family, or your spouse walked out on you, or your dad said that he didn't want to be a part of your family anymore, and you felt rejected, like you were standing on the outside of the community looking in. A member of our teaching team tells the story about a time that he was in downtown Chicago meeting a few friends for dinner. His friend had sent him a text message the night before saying that the restaurant's dress code was business casual. Now, we all know what business casual means. It means you need to wear some slacks, tuck in your shirt, but no jacket or ties required, right? Oh, and no sneakers. That's what business casual means, technically. But my friend was kind of under the impression that business casual just simply meant you need to look good. And so he put on something that he felt made him look good. He even tucked in his shirt. But it's about 4 minutes into the first drink that the host walks over and talks to his buddy that he was with, whispers something into his ear, then escorts my friend out of the restaurant. Why? Because he was wearing jeans. He was removed from the restaurant while his friends enjoyed a very nice dinner. Now, maybe we've had a similar experience where we've been kicked out of a place because of our shoes or jeans or a hat that we wore, something like that. But that pales into comparison to some of the shame inflicted on others of us. I mean, it's back in the early 60s, at the dawn of the civil rights movement, that some courageous men and women like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. said that the color of one's skin should not determine one's rights. But they had to say this from the outside looking in because those on the inside, including many Christians, said that being black makes you unclean, or being an immigrant makes you unclean, or being even a woman means that you're not allowed to have certain types of rights. I mean, think of all the voices throughout history that had to fight from the outside in because those on the inside declare that because of your color or your gender or your socioeconomic status, that you're unclean. This wasn't just a problem back in Leviticus. It's still a problem today. Back to our friends that were sitting on that hillside listening to Jesus. Throughout this series, we've talked about how the people of Jesus, the people that Jesus was talking to, they weren't religious superstars. They weren't a part of the it crowd, religiously speaking. They weren't the celebrated. They weren't the important. They weren't the powerful. Chances are, many of them were on that outside of the community looking in. Remember what we said earlier about the court system? It's up to either that judge or the jury to declare whether somebody's in good standing, right? Well, What we see here is that for hundreds of years, the religious leaders, the experts in the law, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they had been holding court and declaring people either clean or unclean, righteous or unrighteous, in good or in bad standing with God. For hundreds of years, the Pharisees were speaking for God as if they were God. But then, a man named Jesus enters the scene. And this man isn't just any man. This man's also God. Jesus is God in flesh. Jesus is God with skin on. And Jesus has come to show us who God really is. I mean, look what Jesus himself tells us. He said these words. He says, "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees the Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does." Elsewhere, Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." And even a third place, he says this. He said, "For I did not speak of my own, but the Father who sent me commanded me to say all that I've spoken." See where this is going? See what this means? It means that Jesus has come to speak on behalf of God, not the Pharisees, not the religious leaders, not the experts in the law. They don't get to speak for God. God will speak for himself through Jesus. Jesus is both the judge and the jury. He alone gets to declare who is clean, who's unclean, who's righteous, who's unrighteous. A man named Jesus enters the scene, and everything changes. There's so many things that I could say about Jesus. I mean, so many examples that I could give. In fact, the Gospel of John says that if the life of Jesus, if all the stories about the life of Jesus were written down, I mean, all the books in the world couldn't hold it. But let me just share one story of what Jesus came to do. For 12 years, for 12 grueling years, a woman in the community suffered from constant bleeding. Because of the law, she was declared unclean. She was banished from the community that she had once belonged. For years upon years, she had searched for a cure, but she couldn't find one. Ashamed and alone, she sat outside the city gates longing to be a part of her former community. But the bleeding and the shame and the embarrassment, it never stopped. Then a man named Jesus entered through those city gates. He's surrounded by a mob of people who have now seen that this man is not just any man. Jesus is on his way to one of the temple leaders' homes when this woman, who's been bleeding for 12 years and shaking with fear, she reaches out and she touches the fringe of his robe. She believes that this man could be the remedy for not only her disease, but for her uncleanliness. And immediately, the bleeding stopped. Jesus turns and asks who touched his robe. I mean, there's 1,000 people following you. It could have been anyone, the disciples responded to him. But Jesus knew that this touch was different than any other. It was the touch that communicated desperation. Look how the writer of the book of Luke describes the scene. He says this, he says, "But Jesus said, 'Someone deliberately touched me, for I felt the healing power go out from me.'" When the woman realized that she could not stay hidden, she began to tremble. She fell to her knees in front of Jesus. 12 years of shame, 12 years of pain, 12 years of loneliness. And now this woman is on her knees in front of all the people who've declared her unclean, who said that she was unrighteous and therefore unloved by God. And she has to explain her actions. Imagine the fear in her heart at this moment. Verse 48 reads that the whole crowd heard her explain why she had touched him, and she had been immediately healed. "Daughter," Jesus said to her, "your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Do you see what's happening here? The story of the bleeding woman being healed from is the entire reason that we're here today. I mean, because we follow a man named Jesus who entered the scene and speaking on God's behalf, he spoke to a woman who had been deemed unclean and unrighteous in the eyes of everyone else. And this man named Jesus declared, "You are clean. You are whole. You are righteous. You are loved by God. Regardless of what everyone else in the community thinks about you, you are loved. You are declared righteous by me. You are in good standing with God, restored to the community. How many of us let what other people think about us determine our worth? I mean, how many of us allow the jury of our peers to determine our good standing with others or even God? And let me say something rather sobering here. How many times has the church spoken for God, acting as judge and jury over who God declares as righteous or unrighteous, as clean or unclean? I mean, the church has a history of speaking for God in ways that God really never asked to be spoken for. Am I right? But Jesus came to say that the only opinion that ultimately matters is His. And He declares you are in good standing with God. That is righteousness. But if we're already declared righteous by Jesus, what does it mean for us to hunger and thirst for righteousness? I mean, the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years longed to be in good standing with God. She was hungering, she was thirsting to be in good standing with Him. Jesus said to that woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years, He said these words. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. You see, the only requirement for you to be in good standing with God is faith. Is trusting that Jesus is the one who can save you, that what He says about you is actually true. It's not about our behavior. It's not about our actions. It's not about the color of our skin. It's not about our gender or our socioeconomic status. It's not about how much scripture we've memorized or how many times we've been to church in the past year that puts us in good standing with God. It's about faith. It's about trusting that Jesus is who He says that He is, and that what Jesus says about us is true. In Romans chapter 5, Paul writes something so beautiful that you just have to hear it. And here it is in the Message paraphrase version of the Bible. It says this. It says, by entering through faith into what God has always wanted to do for us, to set us right with Him, to make us fit for Him, we have it all together with God because of our Master Jesus. And that's not all. We throw open our doors to God and discover that at the same moment He has already thrown open His door to us. We find ourselves standing where we always hoped we might stand, out in the wide open spaces of God's grace and glory, standing tall and shouting our praise. Isn't that beautiful? So here's the million-dollar question. Do you believe what Jesus says about you is true? Do you have faith in what He says to you? Are you going to allow others to be the judge and jury of your life? Do you hunger and thirst for their approval? Or will you let God's amazing love both fill you and be the final word about who you are in His eyes? And there's a wider question for us as a church. Are we as believers, as a community of believers, going to speak for God in areas where God has not asked us to speak? Are we going to be judge and jury over anyone else's righteousness or unrighteousness? Over anyone else's cleanliness or uncleanliness? No, because that's not our role. Our role is to be the tangible expression of God's love to our community, just as Jesus came and was God in the flesh. I mean, after Jesus rose from the grave and ascended to heaven, He left the responsibility of being that expression of God's love to us, to you and to me. Can we be that church? A church community that will be that expression of God's love for all people. In the movie Chocolat, do you remember what happened to the mayor who tried to do everything in his power to shut down that chocolate shop and to drive its owner away from the town? Well, it turns out that he too had a hunger for chocolate, just like everyone else. If you remember the scene, in kind of this fit of rage, he begins to destroy the shop's window display. But in the process, this small flake of chocolate lands on his lip, and he tastes it. And it is a beautiful thing. He ends up devouring everything in sight. He wakes up the next morning lying face down in this destroyed window display. What I love most about the movie is how the shop owner responds. Instead of shaming him, instead of being angry, instead of retaliating, instead of treating him as unrighteous, like he had treated her, she simply brings him a cold drink. She offers him something to quench his thirst. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. May we be people who live in the fullness of God's love and the place that he has given us in his kingdom through faith in Jesus. And may we be a people who extend God's love and grace to help satisfy the hunger of others. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. A beautiful life is theirs.